Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Lawson from USAID. Jeremy Foster and myself are the co-AORs for the USAID NREL partnership. Welcome to today's webinar, Electrifying Transport in USA Partner Countries, Key Issues and Case Studies, brought to you by the partnership's Emerging Technologies Task. Today's webinar is only for USAID participants, although we also welcome a couple PNNL participants. We're expecting around 30 participants to join. So this webinar is for you, and we are welcoming your questions at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce the NREL partnership and the GoToWebinar platform. You have two options for audio, either your computer or your telephone. If you use your computer, please select the microphone and speaker option in the GoToWebinar audio pane. If you use your phone, please select the phone option in the audio pane, and then use the phone number and audio pin on the right side of the display. If you have technical difficulties, contact GoToWebinar's help desk by dialing the number on this slide. After the presentations have concluded, we will have a short question and answer session. If you have any questions, please type them in to the GoToWebinar question pane. It's on the bottom of the right part of your screen, anytime during the webinar. The webinar is also being recorded, and we will share a recording of the presentation within a few days by email. I would like to introduce today's presenters. Alexandra Aznar is a project leader at NREL who specializes in solar public policy and technical assistance for local, state, and national governments. Caley Johnson is a senior transportation market analyst in the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences at NREL. Caley and Alex will be sharing their insights with you shortly. Finally, I would like to provide some context to the USAID NREL partnership. USAID and NREL partners to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable power to the developing world. The USAID NREL partnership addresses critical aspects of deploying advanced energy systems in developing countries through policy, planning, and deployment support, as well as global technical platforms. The USAID NREL partnership's global technical platforms provide free, state-of-the-art support on critical challenges to scaling up advanced energy systems. These platforms include the Renewable Energy Explorer, Greening the Grid, the International Jobs and Economic Development Impacts IJEDI model, and the Resilient Energy Platform. Also, you may recall that we sent out a survey to the USAID field and home office to find out which emerging technologies topics are most important to you. And the topics that you selected are electric vehicles, energy storage, and cybersecurity. So those are the three topics that we plan to focus our work on through the Emerging Technologies Task this year. One of the first things we'll be doing is rolling out 2 new toolkits on electric vehicles and storage that will be housed on the Greening the Grid website, as well as new information that will be hosted on the Resilient Energy Platform site on cybersecurity. So please look out for our first reports on the building blocks of electric vehicles and also an energy storage decision guide in the next 3 to 6 months. And on storage, we'll also be collaborating closely with our colleagues at Power Africa through the Energy Storage Working Group. With that introduction, I will hand it over to Caley, who can kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to start with a brief introduction to NREL for anyone that's not very familiar with us. We started in 1977, focused on solar energy research. And so that became one of our major pillars of research is renewable power. And then, let's see, in 1991, we're adopted into the family of national laboratories. And so most of our funding comes from the Department of Energy, but also a substantial and growing amount from other sources. We got into energy efficiency as one of our other major pillars later on, working on building efficiency and manufacturing efficiency and overall reducing our energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And then we got into sustainable transportation. We work on a variety of fuels and a variety of vehicles, and now we're getting into a larger kind of mobility systems push. And in general, NREL a few years ago started a fourth pillar, the energy systems integration, where we looked at all the different systems, including electric grids, our various fuel sources, transportation, and how interrelated they've all become. And so we've got some supercomputers kind of geared towards simulating these systems and their interactions. So that's become our fourth major pillar of research. Let's see, I'm having a little trouble. There we go. And so I'm in the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences, and our overall goal right now is to reduce the energy used for the mobility that we need to live our lives. And this is in an environment where there are a number of disruptive technologies that have recently entered the scene. One of these is shared mobility, such as shared vehicles. The average vehicle in the U.S. is parked 95% of the time. And so you can see there are huge benefits to sharing vehicles, and as well as bicycles, now scooters everywhere, and other forms of mobility. And that has been enabled by new coordinating technologies, mobility on demand like Uber and Lyft, goods on demand like Uber Eats, connected and automated vehicles. What are we going to do as automated vehicles become more commonplace and easier to purchase? Various emerging fuels and powertrains, that very much so includes electric vehicles. As a matter of fact, electric vehicles and electric mobility are kind of an enabling and a cross-cutting technology throughout all of these. And then finally, you have new modes of transport, such as autonomous shuttles and other forms of transport. I think scooters would count as electric scooters would also count as a relatively new mode of transport. And so just to get a feel for kind of our work on reducing the energy use throughout all of these, I want to paint kind of an ideal versus a dystopian picture of how all of these technologies could come about. For the ideal picture, you could get up, your automated Uber picks you up with 3 other people, drops you off at the train station. At the other end of the train station, you unlock an e-bike with an app, get to work, park the bike in front because there's no huge parking lot getting in the way, and you get to work. You're at work. It was all very efficient. It used very little energy. It required a minimum amount of space and infrastructure. It emitted a minimum amount of health deteriorating criteria pollutants. So that's kind of the ideal scenario, but we want to investigate how these technologies can be used going in that direction. And that's opposed to the dystopian scenario where, let's say, you move 3 hours away from work because you know that you can just wake up at 5 p.m., sleep in your gasoline autonomous vehicle that you own, get to work. Everyone drove to work, so there's no place to park. So you have your autonomous vehicle drive out to the suburbs to the cheapest parking lots where there are just gigantic parking lots wasting a lot of land and a lot of space. So that's kind of to give you the two pictures where this suite of technologies, these disruptive technologies, could take us. And so most of our research is aiming us towards that ideal scenario. So for our center's electric vehicle capabilities, what specifically are we doing? On the technology side, we've been researching battery composition for years. Are there different battery chemistries that could have better performance? Thermal management is a big deal in the battery world. Batteries can lose a lot of efficiency and a lot of life if you don't manage their heat properly. So we've become the main national lab researching thermal management, and then of course powertrains for electric vehicles. At the fleet level, we are training we're training fleet managers and guiding and leading workshops. We're the technical support for the Department of Energy's Clean Cities program, which is their flagship transportation technology integration program. And let's see, we do drive cycle analyses to match the right electric vehicle up with the right application and make sure that the chargers, I'm going to call chargers EVSEs throughout this presentation. That's kind of the more technical term for them that avoids some confusion. So we make sure that the EVSEs are located in the most convenient places. And then we do EVSE planning and installation tools to kind of let municipalities know how many EVSEs they'll need and where they need to be. On the systems level, we research the different mobility alternatives. You know, if we're trying to get people out of single occupancy conventional vehicles. We have many mobility alternatives, including the simplest ones that developing countries are actually beating us at of pedestrians and bicycle ridership. You know, we want to make sure that those can be retained and possibly added back into the mix in developed countries. We look into the grid, the facilities, renewables, and EV analysis. We research cybersecurity for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles can be a bit more vulnerable. They have more points of intrusion for malware. So we want to make sure that they're secure, because there are definitely high risks with malware on vehicles, especially autonomous vehicles. And then some of our deployment activities, we do technical support and transition planning in the field. Kind of if groups are having technical problems, they can contact us. We do policy and regulatory analysis. We do fleet route analysis, and then we have web tools and data for transitioning to EVs. And we put many of these web tools, we put the more user-friendly ones that we want to make available to the public, we put on the Alternative Fuels Data Center, AFDC. So I'd recommend that you take a look at that if you're interested in finding more of these web tools and the data, because it's very important that we, get more data out there, make it available to more researchers, so that we can all work together to optimize our mobility systems. And so I'm in the technology integration group within the Transportation Center, and when it comes to electric vehicles and getting them out there being used successfully, we want to look at the benefits that electric vehicles have and really try to maximize the benefits by finding the right application for electric vehicles and implementing them properly. And we want to minimize the barriers to electric vehicle adoption. And so these benefits, one big one is that electric vehicles are 3 to 4 times more efficient per joule of energy. Conventional vehicles waste a lot of energy in waste, heat, and noise, both of which are pains to deal with anyway. And electric vehicles don't waste any energy, or waste very little energy into heat and noise. So they're 3 to 4 times more efficient. They have lower fuel and maintenance costs, which in many cases makes for a pretty quick payback period. If you purchase a more expensive electric vehicle, you can pay it back over the life of the vehicle, and their emissions are reduced. The greenhouse gas emissions are reduced overall. The amount depends a bit on your grid mix of electricity, but for the most, in the vast majority of locations, they have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And they have fewer moving parts, and therefore they have less maintenance costs on a pretty consistent basis. Electric vehicles emissions are reduced. Overall, their greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. And those criteria pollutants that hurt people's health, the ones that form ozone pollution, carbon monoxide, are displaced. You get to displace them out to the power plants where they've been located, hopefully downwind of major populations that are breathing. And also you can put big scrubbers on the power plants to pull those emissions out of the exhaust. Electric vehicles have performance advantages. They have better low-end torque, which essentially what that means is, I don't know if you guys remember driving clutch vehicles, but if you were stopped at the base of a hill, you have to rev the engine up, build up the RPMs before you pop the clutch and go. And that's all a waste of a lot of gasoline because for conventional vehicles, you need high RPMs in order to have high horsepower, whereas electric vehicles have their maximum horsepower and torque starting at 0 RPMs. So there are huge performance benefits in acceleration and towing capacity. And finally, you have electric vehicles' quiet operation, which depending on the location, they could really value that. You know, if you implement an electric vehicle on a tourist resort, that is a very high value feature of electric vehicles. So what are some of the barriers of electric vehicles that we need to get over? The biggest one is the higher upfront costs. And so what we do to try to work through that is that we model the payback period and reach out to different fleets that have a good payback period, where you can pay off those higher upfront costs with the lower fuel and maintenance costs. And so fleets tend to take this life cycle cost more into account than individual drivers. And so we tend to focus on fleets first and then work our way to individual drivers within a given vehicle segment. Another barrier is an electric vehicle's reduced range and charging convenience. And so we really work to model where the EVSEs need to be located, and then we work with municipalities and countries and other organizations to roll out these EVSEs and make sure that they are in the right location and available for people to charge. And it's also good to keep in mind that at least in California, over 85% of people charge in their home, and so that's actually quite convenient. And so some of the work we do is to help people equip themselves to charge at home, even in a multi-unit dwelling. Another barrier is their range is sensitive to temperature and duty cycle. So electric vehicles in some locations, such as Mexicali, which I'll get to in a later slide, end up using a lot of their electricity on air conditioning when it's really hot, and also some electric vehicles, for example, a long-haul truck isn't very amenable to take advantage of the benefits of an electric vehicle. And so we do route analyses to try to help people choose the right vehicle and put their charging infrastructure in the right location. Another barrier is the reduced vehicle variety. And so we've tried to address this by, on our website, the AFDC, we have a vehicle search engine where you can click on electric vehicle, click on what type do you want, such as, let's say, school bus, and it will bring up the available school buses, at least in the U.S. That's not available internationally yet. And then the final barrier that I want to mention is unfamiliarity in the field. The mechanics in an area might not be familiar with electric vehicles. So we run training sessions to bring them up to speed. The first responders, such as the firemen that are going to be responding to accidents, need to take things into account, such as they don't want to be cutting through high voltage wires in the EV. So we work with partners to train them. So those are some of the ways where we've been trying to bolster the benefits and reduce the barriers for electric vehicles. All right, let's look at the overall landscape of EV considerations. First of all, the vehicle technology. As I mentioned, you have a limited number of, limited availability of electric vehicles. You have your light duty vehicles that are actually becoming quite available, that those can be viewed on both the AFCC and also fueleconomy.gov is a great search engine to find good electric light duty vehicles. Buses are becoming increasingly available throughout the world, as are motorcycles. Trucks are lagging behind the other vehicles, but there are a number of electric trucks out there, and quite a few more in the research and development phase, actually in the prototype phase. For charging infrastructure, you have to choose what level. There's levels 1, 2, and 3, which correspond to the voltage and the power of the charger and of the EVSE. And so you have to choose which one you want. And the level 1s take a long time to charge. Level 3s charge in a very short amount of time. But it also comes with increasing strain upon the grid. The faster you charge, the more potential it has to strain the grid. And then you want to take into consideration where the locations of the EVSE are going to be. You want to partner with EVSE hosts that can profit off of EVSE ownership. So most of them can't charge much of a premium for the electricity. So we found that partnering with host organizations that can use EVSEs to essentially bring in a captive audience to their businesses has been very helpful. Walgreens is an example in the U.S. Of a successful partner that has been installing a lot of EVSEs because they've found that if they can get people in their store that have to stay for half an hour instead of the usual 10 minutes, that they'll end up buying more and Walgreens will profit more. So we search for more partners that could have a symbiosis with EVSEs. It's important to set a country's standards for what kind of, essentially what shape their plug is, to make sure it's compatible with all their vehicles. In the U.S., we had made good progress with that with the Society of Automotive Engineers. They set the standard. We were going forward with a certain plug type, and then Tesla came out with their own plug type that they prefer. And so that's kind of an example of an area where the standards created inefficiencies in the system. So now people with any vehicle other than a Tesla can't refuel at the Tesla EVSEs. And so even if they're empty, so that's kind of a wasted resource that's out there. Whereas if all vehicles or if all EVSEs adhere to the same standard and adhere to the same communications protocol, then all the vehicles should be able to search the nearest EVSE and get to that one, and hopefully their onboard computer with the right communications protocol would be able to tell them which ones are empty and when their vehicle is full, when their battery is full. And so that's something that is needed. The communication protocols we have in the U.S. right now are different amongst the different EVSE networks, and we really want to standardize them so one vehicle can use all the EVSE networks and can use any EVSE that is out there. So for the grid and utilities, one of the big factors is load balancing. You don't want to be charging EVSEs when the grid is at peak load and electricity is the most expensive and dirty to produce. There are a number of technologies that enable EVSEs to move off of the peak load. Some as simple as a charge timer that you plug in your EVSE and it's set to start charging at, let's say, 1 a.m. and it's done charging by 5 a.m. So that's one of the more simple technologies, but there are also more complex technologies that help us balance the load. Then, of course, you want to make sure an increasing number of utilities have EV-specific tariff and rates. And so there are tariff and rate designs that can be mutually beneficial to the utility and to the EV owner. And two of these are the time of use pricing to encourage the EVs to charge off peak and demand charges. Overall, EVs are a much more flexible load on the grid than most other loads. Remember that most vehicles, at least in the U.S., are parked 95% of the time, and so that shows great potential flexibility for timing the EV charge properly. Then you want to look at the location on the grid where the EVSE is. So essentially, you want to put it on a circuit under a feeder that is under capacity, that can handle the additional load without upgrades. And then you also want to consider the grid generation mix and increase those renewables to make your EVs cleaner and cleaner when compared to gasoline. There are a number of markets, policy, and societal considerations. One is the market and the manufacturers. As I mentioned, light-duty vehicles are getting a lot of manufacturers. We're getting more buses. We need to get more trucks. The regulatory environment, both for, I guess an example of this is that in the U.S., many states have rules saying that the EVSE networks, they have rules saying that no one except for the sanctioned utility can sell electricity by the kilowatt hour. And this is a problem for the EVSE networks that need to sell their electricity by the kilowatt hour. And so many states have been changing their rules to allow this sales by a secondary source. So that's one example of rules that need to be changed. Another is that as states are missing out on the fuel excise taxes, they're running short on their budgets for road maintenance, and so they are figuring out how to tax EVs so that they can fund their road maintenance. Purchase incentives and financing strategies. There are many ways to incentivize the purchase of electric vehicles. Then there are many equity and environmental justice considerations, especially now while electric vehicles are still more expensive than conventional vehicles. You don't want to reward the wealthy that can afford the electric vehicles with a lot of policies. And so that's where we get into a lot of using electric vehicles as an enabling technology, such as helping complete that last mile travel to get people onto mass transit. That can help communities in need, and there are many other examples of where electric vehicles can be used to help communities in need. And of course, you have the healthcare cost reductions and the overall health improvements of the population from the emissions reductions. So Alex and I are going to take you through a few case studies. NREL works with partners around the globe to answer a variety of questions related to EV deployment. And so we're going to highlight four, kind of starting with very broad ones and focusing down to more narrow ones. We worked with USAID and various ministries of the government of Jamaica for an overall Jamaica transportation greenhouse gas reduction plan. And so this is a very broad one where Jamaica just said that they needed help with their goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector by 10% by 2030. And so this is a big goal. It's tough to really get started and find a starting point. So that's what we aim to do with this project. And in order to do that, we had to model out their business as usual scenario. And so that is the very top line on this chart to the right here. That's their business as usual scenario going forward for how many greenhouse gas emissions they would have reduced for business as usual. And to develop the scenario, we had to extrapolate from whatever data we had available and interpolate and then find proxy data from other nations. So I think that's a common, I'm sure you guys are all used to projects where you end in frustration because of lack of data. And so that's something we've really been working on is how to, in situations without ideal data, what are some good methods for using proxy data and extrapolating from the available data. And so we did that to develop this business as usual scenario. And then we broke the 10% reduction goal down into achievable sub-goals. And so those are the different colors you can see on this wedge analysis here. You can see that the biggest one is the vehicle kilometers traveled reduction projects, where essentially we were stemming the trend for more and more Jamaicans to get to drive in a single occupancy vehicle. And then another big one is the fuel economy improvement projects, and then a few others here that I won't get into. But so we broke those down into achievable sub goals, and then we proposed a suite of projects that could achieve those sub goals and rank those projects according to the size of greenhouse gas reductions, the upfront costs, the timeline for implementation, and the ancillary benefits that they would achieve. And so we kind of wrapped those up in a report and wrote up summaries of those specific projects then. And one thing I'd like to highlight is in Jamaica and many of the other countries that we've worked with, we've modeled out the greenhouse gas benefits for electric vehicles on their specific grid. Jamaica was mostly diesel and 35% natural gas, but they have goals to increase their renewable electricity production, and so we modeled out the electric vehicle benefits as they increase their renewable energy production. And just some kind of high-level take-homes from this were that even, even at 0% renewables, the Nissan Leaf emitted less than its comparable counterpart, conventional counterpart, the Nissan Versa. So everything else is just gravy as they increase their renewables and greenhouse gas reductions increase. Another highlight of this is just showing the benefits of downsizing, from the Toyota Highlander through the Nissan Versa, how that you can get good benefits and you can get substantial benefits from using the Toyota Prius as well. So all in all, this is looking like electric vehicles will be quite beneficial to Jamaica as they grow their renewable percentage from 11% up to 30% here in 2030. Another project we did for the city of Mexicali, and so this was an electric mobility strategy. They had decided they wanted to increase their share of electric mobility, and they had goals to do so, but they didn't really know how to. And so they asked us for for strategy on how to do that. And so this, the left-hand side, we have the outline of the strategy, just to show you some of the topics that we covered. One was grid preparation and management, which can be done in concert with the other steps. You don't have to prepare your grid beforehand, but you need to have a plan to know what you're going to do as the electric vehicle load increases. So you have spatial grid preparation. You want to know where to put the chargers and the EVSEs on the grid, so that will require the fewest upgrades. Temporal grid preparation. You want to be able to highlight fleets and populations that are able to charge on off-peak times, and you want to use technology that helps them to charge on off-peak times. Mexicali really wanted us to focus on electric mobility and mass transit, so we discussed some of the electric bus options, including the old school catenary buses with those overhead lines. Everyone kind of takes those for granted because they're an old technology, but they are good technology. And as a matter of fact, new buses are kind of helping extend the range of those catenary lines that have small, inexpensive batteries that can help gap between catenary lines. And then, of course, you have completing the first and last mile traveled conundrum to be able to help people use electric mobility to get to mass transit. We discussed utilizing fleets as early adopters. As I mentioned earlier, fleets tend to take the full life cycle cost of vehicles into account more than individual drivers. So we discussed how to prioritize the fleets, which ones would be the best ones to electrify first. And we did a fleet route analysis to kind of help solve a few problems with their taxi fleets that I'll talk about in the next slide. And then the next section was expanding from fleets into individual electric vehicle markets. So for that, we did a charging station location analysis. Where would EVSEs be the most beneficial to the most people? And then we talked about purchase incentives, which ones could be the most effective to get people to buy EVs. And then we discussed equity issues, because Mexicali was very concerned about the equity issues of promoting electric mobility. And finally, we talked about capacity building and training to get the workforce up to speed and ready to maintain and rescue electric vehicles after being in accidents and things like that. And so this is an example of their taxi fleet. They had purchased 10 electric vehicles, and they weren't operating very well, largely because they had electric vehicles that had their batteries were air cooled, and they didn't have a very large range. And then Mexicali's extreme temperatures were reducing that range even more, and a lot of the taxi drivers didn't like it. So this is an example of a very light route analysis where we're able to just mail some of these geotab trackers down to them, and they put them in their electric vehicles, and we're able to derive this map below and a number of stats that could help us to recommend which driver drove a route on a regular basis that was more amenable to their current vehicles, and also helped us recommend future EV purchases, which ones would operate better in their extreme heat, have enough range, and this also helped us tell them where the taxi company should put EVSEs to keep their electric vehicles charged. So this is a very light route analysis, and I'm going to hand it over to Alex to talk about one of our more in-depth route analyses for Mexico City's transit buses.
Thanks, Caley. Yeah, I'm going to start with speaking about this evaluation that NREL worked on in partnership with USAID Mexico and the implementing partners down there, and the city of Mexico City and Leon, Mexico. And as a little bit of background here, the transport sector produces about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions in Mexico. And so it's really a key sector that the federal government and state and local governments are concerned with. And it's a key sector outlined in Mexico's National Determined Contributions as part of the Paris Climate Accords. So the key question that these partners had was, what is the potential for transit bus electrification in these two cities? And so as a first step here, the research team engaged the transit agencies in Mexico City and León to understand which routes would be of interest for electrifying and to understand what the characteristics were of the existing diesel fleets that ran those routes typically. Then the team used GPS and special CAN data loggers. So they actually went down to Mexico, put these on about 30 buses over the course of 2 to 4 week period. These loggers track data on key vehicle information, such as the speed of the buses, the distance that they were traveling, and the frequency of these stops. And then this data was used to model and analyze diesel and electric bus drive cycles to understand the energy and battery size requirements needed to complete these routes. So what you can see here on the right is a map. It's a heat map showing the two routes that were evaluated in the city of León. And there are similar maps in the report for those in Mexico City. So you can actually see where these buses traveled and how frequently they traveled. So then the research team took this data and determined that these bus routes are actually quite aggressive. That means that the buses are traveling at slow speeds and they're starting and stopping frequently. And this is very conducive to electrification. And in fact, these electric buses are approximately 3 times more efficient on a kilometer per liter equivalent basis than diesel buses. And they would lower the overall CO2 emissions, taking into account the electricity mix and the tailpipe emissions. And the NREL team was able to model and provide a recommendation on the battery size needed to complete these routes, and determined that there are technologies commercially available today that could complete these routes. And so with this information, the transit agencies were then able to know that these technologies exist, and it's a matter of looking at the economics and to see if they wanted to deploy these technologies. So now I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about a different case study where, again, we were working with stakeholders in Mexico City, but this time looking at motorcycle electrification. And the key questions we're looking at here are some of the options and barriers for electrification of transport in Mexico City and the benefits of electrifying motorcycles in the city. So this project started with 2 focus groups that were conducted in Mexico City in February 2019. And they brought together representatives from the automobile and energy industry, the electric service providers in Mexico, NGOs, academia, and government to explore some of these key questions. And I'd like to point out that this diversity of stakeholders that were at these focus groups underscores how complicated these transport and electromobility issues can be, because there are often multiple authorities involved in managing transportation, from transit agencies to utilities to local and state and national officials. And each entity typically has a different level of authority and different levels of influence over this sector. So I don't think this is unique to Mexico City. I think this is quite common in many places that we all work in. So as a result of these focus groups, the participants agreed that electric mobility is really a key opportunity to reduce emissions and improve mobility in the city, but that public policy intervention is required. And the group focused on electrification of motorcycles because city officials saw this as a big opportunity, given concerns with that first and last kilometer. So people having a hard time getting to that point of mass transit. And the city had seen an increase in motorcycle deployment over the past few years, particularly with this proliferation of on-demand gig deliveries. So your Uber Eats, you call Uber to get your hamburger and somebody delivers that on one of these diesel motorcycles or gasoline motorcycles. So after the focus groups, NREL conducted a technical analysis to explore the potential benefits that could be gained through electrifying these motorcycles. And the team used mobility and environmental data sets provided by Mexico City, as well as the state and federal partners. And some of these data sets were vehicle registration data, household level survey data, and some atmospheric modeling. And after crunching those numbers, the team found that motorcycles, they make up about 2% of trips in Mexico City right now, but they make up a higher vehicle kilometers traveled share. And these motorcycles are particularly popular in the edges of Mexico City. These gasoline-powered motorcycles do emit air pollutants at a higher level than automobiles, and they carry fewer passengers on average. And so it makes sense that electrifying one motorcycle has proportionally larger air quality benefit than electrifying one automobile. And this graph here on the right just shows some scenario analysis that the team did. And so it shows the emissions benefits from motorcycles and cars for cases of 0%, 25%, and 50% of motorcycle kilometer traveled electrification. So you can see that as there are more kilometers electrified, those emissions go down. And the team lastly determined that the electrification of motorcycles in the periphery of the city, where they're most heavily used, could promote better air quality and provide more equitable access to mobility. And when our colleagues presented these results to Mexico City's Secretary of Mobility, he noted that this kind of information would be really helpful for him to be able to push additional regulation or better enforcement of existing regulations, such as permitting and licensing of these motorcycles in Mexico City, which the city is struggling to do right now. Oh, let me go back here, and I'll just end with one final case study. This is some work that we did here in the United States with the city, or with Minnesota and some cities and stakeholders in Minnesota. But I think it's an interesting one because it demonstrates the benefits of integrating electric vehicles with other renewable technologies such as solar. So I just wanted to point out that the key question here was looking at, would it be cost effective to match solar with workplace EV charging? And NREL used a REOP model to evaluate that question, and there were two key results, which are here over on the right. If you look at the top graph, you can see that the team looked at what happens when there's static charging. So this is when you plug in your electric vehicle at work at 9 in the morning and it pulls all of the power it needs immediately, versus what happens when you have a more flexible or managed charging, which is that blue line there. And you can see with that blue line, with this charging spread over across the day, that the demand goes down and you are able to reduce demand charges and lower your electricity bill. And then at the same time, if you look at the lower chart, you can see that when you pair the managed charging with PV production, it spreads out the charging throughout the day and it better matches with that solar output, and that also produces a cost savings. And so this has led to some pilot projects of PV plus EV charging in Minnesota. So I'll end there. I know we're really close on time and want to open it up to some other questions, and I'll pass it on to Sarah.
Thanks to Alex and Caley for these really highly informative presentations. So the partnership is poised to help developing countries, and you are developing country mission partners to meet their electric transportation goals. So let us know if any of these capabilities interest you, how we can support your goals. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Jeremy Foster, or any of our presenters for more information. That said, we can take some questions. And we did actually have a question already before the presentation from the Pakistan team regarding U.S. battery energy manufacturers. So why don't I just repeat that for the group? And let's see, Alex or Caley, if you want to answer this, or we can also have a separate conversation to answer this later. So this question is from Jeff Humber on the best way to get U.S. battery manufacturers interested in the Pakistan market, either in terms of battery sales, manufacturing, production of electric vehicles, and battery components, or in terms of joint venturing with Pakistan industrial houses. So the question is, does NREL have an opinion of industry associations in this area, particularly, say, the Rechargeable Battery Association, or there was another council that he mentioned, or any sense on how to approach them, or recommendations on how to get U.S. companies interested in markets abroad, which is obviously a big focus for this administration? Alex or Caley, do you want to take that question, or we can also try to answer that later? It's kind of
yeah. All right. And thanks for submitting this beforehand. That was actually quite handy because I didn't know, but I asked some of my colleagues that know more, that are more into the battery manufacturing, and they said they recommended the Battery Council International (BCI) that they've been active in, and they thought that would be the best platform for kind of making those connections. And then there's also the United States Advanced Batium Consortium, which is part of the U.S. Council for Automotive Research. It's like a pretty big, well-funded council. So they recommended that as also another potential for making those connections. And then one of my colleagues said that he serves on committees for Underwriters Laboratories that certifies batteries and stuff. And he said that those, even though their purpose is to certify them and standardize them and make sure that they're safe, he said that could still be a good circle to make those connections in. So I think those are the three recommendations that I'm going to pass on from my colleagues that are into battery research.
Great, thanks, Caley. We had one question from Don McCubbin. What is an EVSU? I don't know, Don, if you meant EVSE, the electric vehicle charging unit that Caley was using, or maybe I missed that term.
I think it must have been EVSE, because there is no EVSU that I know of. So electric vehicle charge equipment are essentially the plugs that you charge your vehicle with. And the reason that we don't really want to call them chargers is because each vehicle has an onboard charger. And so when talking with the automotive people, that is the charger. When talking to the infrastructure people that are just focused on the external parts, we want to refer to those external plugs as the EVSE, the electric vehicle supply equipment. So it seems kind of nitpicky to stick to that terminology instead of just calling them chargers, but it saves quite a bit of confusion when talking to the automotive manufacturers and to the car people.
This is a question from Jamil Masood. Are there examples of commercial EVSE deployment based primarily on solar PV with grid backup? If so, would they use intermediate on-site battery storage to optimize the solar panel utilization? And if so, how does it affect the overall charging economics versus pure grid-based chargers? So that's a really specific question. And maybe after that, I was hoping if maybe our two presenters could also just respond to a general question, which is that we've heard a lot of interest in EVs, I think, around the world, and a lot of countries are not very particularly savvy on what they should do. They know they should plan for it, but they're not sure what the first steps are. So maybe Caley and Alex, you could tell us what are the very first steps that system operators or that the ministries of energy, all our stakeholders that we talk to should be thinking about when they're approaching this issue for the first time.
All right. So for the examples of pairing EVSEs with solar power, we have we have one on the NREL campus that we're running tests on and everything with storage. So I could put you in touch with the guy that is in charge of that. And we've also worked with the transportation department of Santa Clara that's using it on their buses. So that's I can put you in touch with them also for more details. And so sorry for your question on when thinking about like first steps for pairing solar with EVSEs. I think I would say the number one consideration is using net metering instead of battery storage. There are resilience reasons for using battery storage and having kind of a self-sustained solar panel and charger if the grid gets knocked out. But for the vast majority of cases, I would say that that groups are, putting the solar panels on, putting the EVSEs in, using the grid as their storage through net metering, and they can still, for any publicity purposes, they can still say, hey, this, 100% of the electricity going into our vehicles is solar powered. They still have the right to say that, even though it's just like on any renewable electricity market. That label of renewable doesn't track that exact electron. You just count the number of electrons into the grid and then the number of electrons out of the grid. So, that'd be my recommendation is getting the solar panels and the charger and using net metering as the storage. It's a lot cheaper than using batteries, unless you're doing it for resilience purposes, in which case then battery storage is definitely key. We're doing a resilience project in Florida where we're looking into that, because Florida has already equipped their hurricane shelters, which are elementary schools, with solar panels, and so we're kind of pursuing steps on adding stationary storage and electric vehicles to fulfill some of their transportation needs.
Thanks, Caley.
I
was also wondering, maybe more generally, as countries think about this topic as a whole, what are the first steps maybe they should take as they think about these issues? And how can we help them think through that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here briefly, and Caley, feel free to jump in. I think it's really important as a first step for countries and stakeholders looking at these problems to understand, well, what are the key goals? What are you trying to accomplish with vehicle electrification? Is it a local air pollutant problem? Is it reducing GHG emissions? Is it creating additional mobility services? Because that can really point to different kinds of fleets, for example, that you would target. And then understanding who those key stakeholders are that you need to bring into the room, because as I mentioned, there are usually multiple stakeholders involved in the transport sector. You're not going to get anything accomplished if you're ignoring the utility, for example. So you really have to understand your goals and the key stakeholders necessary before you can really begin on a particular project.
I agree.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and to attendees for joining today. We hope you enjoyed your presentation and hope you have a safe and productive shelter-in-place day wherever you are. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.